Now that Ferguson and Meddy were safely out of the way, he could give his attention to the damage that had been done. Had Ferguson and Meddy actually come in to tap off a sample as he had suggested to Willows? He looked around at the wreckage in the antechamber. Quite obviously, the heavy door of the sample chamber was wide open, and it certainly appeared that the wreckage was scattered from that point. Cautiously, he went over to look at the open sample chamber. It looked all right, except that the bottom was covered with a bright, metallic dust. He rubbed his finger over it and looked at the fingertip. A very fine dust, and yet it hadn't been scattered very much by the explosion. Heavy. Very likely osmium. Osmium 187 was stable, but it wasn't a normally used step toward mercury 203. 4 successive alpha captures would give polonium 203, not mercury. Ditto for an oxygen fusion. It could be iridium or platinum, of course. Whatever it was, the instruments in his helmet told him it wasn't hot. He had a hunch that Ferguson and Meddy had been building mercury 203 from hafnium 179 by the process of successive fusions with hydrogen 3, and that something had gone wrong with the H3 production. It appeared that the explosion had been a simple chemical blast caused by the air oxidation of H2, but the bleeder vent at the other end of the reactor had apparently kicked at the same time. An enormous amount of unused energy had been released, blowing the entire emergency bleeder system out. Something didn't seem right. Something stuck in his craw, and he couldn't figure out what it was. He opened up the conduit boxes that led through the antechamber from the control console to the reactor beyond the firewall. Everything looked fine. That meant that whatever it was that had fouled up the controls was on the other side of the firewall. "How does it look?" Willow's voice came worriedly over the earphones. "Have I already said damn?" de Hooch asked. "You have," Willows said with forced lightness. "You even said double damn." "Factorial damn, then," said de Hooch. "What's the matter?" "Apparently the foul-up is on the other side of the firewall." "Are you going in?" "I'll have to." "All right. Watch yourself." "I will." He went over to the periscope that surveyed the part of the reactor beyond the firewall. Everything looked normal enough. He carefully checked the pressure gauge. Normal. "Check the spectro for me, will you?" he asked. "Make sure that's just the normal helium atmosphere in there." "Sure." A pause. "Nothing but helium, Guz. What were you expecting?" "I don't think I'd care to walk into a hydrogen atmosphere at 300 centigrade." "Neither would I, but how could there be hydrogen in there?" "There shouldn't be, but there's something screwy going on here, and I can't put my finger on it." "Well, whatever it isn't hydrogen in the reactor room." "Okay, stand by. I'm going in." He walked over to the firewall door. On the other side of it was a small chamber where the oxygen and nitrogen of normal air would be swept out before he opened the inner door to go into the inner chamber itself. There was no need for an airlock, since small amounts of impurities in the He4 didn't bother anything. It was just as he turned the lever that undogged the firewall door that he realized his mistake. But it was too late. The door jerked outward, and a hot wind picked him up and slammed him against the far wall. There was a moment of pain. Then, nothing. There was something familiar about the man who was turning the wheel, but de Hooch couldn't place it. The man was wearing a black hood, as befitted a torturer and executioner. "Idiot," said the hooded man, giving the wheel of the rack a little more pressure. "Explain the following. If a half plus a half is equal to a whole, why is hafnium plus hafnium not equal to holmium?" Stretched as he was on the rack, de Hooch could not think straight because of the excruciating pain. "Because a half is 8.28% heavier than a whole," said de Hooch. "You are an idiot nonetheless," said the torturer. He gave the wheel another twist. De Hooch wanted to scream, but he couldn't. "Try again," said the torturer. "What is a half plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus—" "Stop!" screamed de Hooch. "Stop! Stop at the osmium!" "Ah, but it didn't stop at the osmium," said the hooded man. "It went on and on and on. Plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4, until there were so many plus 4s in there that the place looked like an old-fashioned golf course." "My legs hurt," said de Hooch. The man was no longer wearing a hood, but de Hooch couldn't tell if it was Willows or himself. "We will all go together when we go," said the man. De Hooch turned his head away and looked at the ceiling, and he realized that it was the ceiling of the antechamber. "My legs hurt," he repeated, and he could hear the hoarse whisper inside the helmet. He realized that he was lying flat on his back. He had been jarred around quite a bit in the suit. He wondered if he could sit up. He managed to get both arms behind him and push himself into a sitting position. He wiggled his feet. The servos responded. He hurt all over, but a little experiment told him that he was only bruised. Nothing was broken. He hadn't been hit as hard as Ferguson and Meddy had been. "Willows?" he said. "Willows?" There was no answer from the earphones. He looked at the chronometer dial inside his helmet. 0249. He had been unconscious less than 10 minutes. The same glance brought his eyes to two other dials. The internal radiation of the suit was a little high, but nothing to worry about. But the dial registering the external radiation was plenty high. Without the protection of the suit, he wouldn't have lived through those 10 minutes. Where was Willows? And then he knew, and he pushed any thought of further help from that quarter out of his mind. What had to be done would have to be done by Peter de Hooch alone. He climbed to his feet. His head hurt, and he swayed with nausea and pain. Only the massive weight of the suit's shoes kept him upright. Then it passed, and he blinked his eyes and shook his head to clear it. He found he was holding his breath, and he let it out. The trouble had been so simple, and yet he hadn't seen it. Oh, yes he had. He must have, subconsciously. Otherwise, how would he have guessed that the stuff in the sampling chamber was osmium-187? Ferguson and Meddy had been trying to make mercury-203 by adding 8 successive tritium nuclei to hafnium-179, progressing through tantalum-182, tungsten-185, rhenium-188, osmium-191, iridium-194, platinum-197, and gold-200, all of which were unstable. But the hydrogen-3 reaction had gone wrong. The doubling had set in, producing helium-4. Successive additions of the alpha particles to hafnium-179 had produced first tungsten-183 and then osmium-187, both of which were stable. Ferguson and Meddy, seeing that something was wrong, drew off a sample and then reset the reaction to produce the Hg-203 they wanted. Then they had come down to pick up the sample. They hadn't realized that the helium production had gone wild. Much more helium than necessary was being produced, and the bleeder valve had failed. When they opened the sample chamber, they got a blast of high-pressure helium right in the face. The shock of that sudden release had jarred the whole atmosphere inside the reaction chamber, and the bleeder valve had let go. But the violence of the pressure release had caused a fault to the surface to open up and had closed the valve again, jammed it, probably. There had been enough pressure left in there to blow de Hooch up against the nearest wall when he opened the door. Since the pressure indicator system was connected to the release system, when one had failed, the other had failed. That's why the pressure gauge had indicated normal. And, of course, it had been the pressure differential that had caused the controls to stick. Well, they ought to be all right now, then. He decided he'd better take a look. The firewall door was still open. He walked over to it and stepped into the smaller chamber that led to the inner reactor room. The inside door, much weaker than the outer firewall door, had been blown off its hinges. He stepped past it and went on in. What he saw made him jerk his glance away from the periscope in his helmet and check his radiation detectors again. Not much change. Relief swept over him as he looked back at the reactor itself. The normally dead black walls were glowing a dull red. It was pure thermal heat, but it shouldn't be doing that. Moving quickly, he went over to the place where the control cables came in through the firewall. It took him several minutes to assure himself that they would function from the control room now. There was nothing more to do but get out of here and get that reaction damped. He went out again, closing the firewall door behind him and dogging it tight. There would be no more helium production now. He went through the radiation trap to the decontamination chamber to wash off whatever it was he had picked up. The decontamination room was a mess. De Hooch stared at the twisted pipes and the stream of water that gushed out of a cracked valve. The blast had jarred everything loose. Well, he could still scrub himself off. Except that the scrubbers weren't working. He swore under his breath and twisted the valve that was supposed to dispense detergent. It did, thank heaven. He doused himself good with it and then got under the flowing water. The radiation level remained exactly where it was. He walked over and pulled one of the brushes off the defunct scrubber and sudsed it up. It wasn't until he started to use it that he got a good look at his arms. He hadn't paid any attention before. He walked over to the mirror to get a good look. "You look magnificent," he told his reflection acidly. The radiation-proof armor looked as though it had been chrome-plated. But de Hooch knew better than that. He knew exactly what had happened. He was nicely plated all over with a film of mercury, which had amalgamated itself with the metallic surface of the suit. He was thoroughly wet with the stuff, and no amount of water and detergent would take it off. There was something wrong with number 2 reactor, all right. It had leaked out some of the mercury 203 that Ferguson and Metty had been making. He thought a minute.